Jonathan, do you want me to hold on for one or two more, or shall we make a start at a minute?
Yeah, give it another. It's bang on 6:30 now, so let's give it no more than 2 minutes, and you can start.
Okay. Got 29 here. Shall we make a start then, Jonathan? Yes. Hello, everybody. Good evening. I think we're ready to make a start. So, good evening. My name is Ken Crofton, and I've got the honour of being the chairman of East Herts Council, and I'm here to welcome you all to this Holocaust Memorial Day commemoration. We are honoured that Deputy Lieutenant Michael McGrath has been able to join us. Good evening, sir. And this day is also to commemorate every year. This is a day that every year is commemorated near or close to the 27th of January, as it was on this day back in 1945 that the Nazi death camp at Auschwitz in Poland was liberated by the Soviet troops. Welcome to other distinguished guests this evening, which include the chairman of North Herts, Val Bryant, I think you're here. The chairman of Watford Borough Council, Bill Mathur, the mayor of Bishop Stortford, Keith Warnell, and Bob Deering, the mayor of Hertford, and the chairman of Ware, Ian Kemp. So my vice chairman, Ian Devonshire, are you here, Ian? I think you are. He's here, and the chairman of Harlow and Welwyn Garden City Synagogues, and all the other guests that have joined us this evening, either on Zoom or in East Herts District Council, or East Herts District on YouTube. You're all very welcome. Now I'd like to pass you over to the East Herts Council Cabinet Member for Communities. It's Councillor Jonathan Kay.
Thank you very much indeed, Ken. Yes, good evening, everybody. And I know a number of people will be watching on the East Herts District YouTube channel because they've mentioned that to me. So welcome to you all. We're going to, well, I'll tell you briefly about who'll be joining us later. Sabrina Groschel, who I had a brief word with a few minutes ago. Sabrina is the UK Programme Director of a charity from Germany called Action Reconciliation Service for Peace. And they actually send to this country a couple of youngsters each year who work with Holocaust survivors. And we'll hear more about that, the work they do, why they do it. We'll also hear from those volunteers as well. I saw Laura Val on this line a few minutes ago. Laura is Italian, but I think her family live in Germany currently. She'll be telling us about her experiences here and what she does during the course of a week. And Daniel Gersten, who comes from Germany, I think was joining us as well. We'll hear from them later. Also, Catherine Henderson. Catherine Henderson was involved and set up a few years ago Hearts Welcomes Syrian Refugees. It's now called Hearts Welcome Refugees, because she's also now dealing with a recent intake of refugees from Afghanistan. And she's also put together an amazing animation that we will have a look at a little bit later on. We'll have other guests as well. But first this evening, a few words from the leader of East Hearts Council, Linda Hazy.
Thank you, Jonathan, and good evening, and again, welcome. Last year saw the 80th anniversary of the 90-minute meeting held in a villa on the Wannsee, a lake on the western edge of Berlin, in which the Holocaust was planned and nibbles and cognac were consumed. There was only one point on the agenda: the organizational, logistical, and material steps for what the Nazis called a final solution of the Jewish question in Europe. This anniversary has a very special resonance as the number of survivors in the Holocaust dwindles, but as anti-Semitism becomes resurgent in Europe and across into the US as well. 4 people were held as hostages in a synagogue in Texas last week, and anti-Semitic crimes are on the increase in Germany. So 80 years ago, the minutes taken at that meeting, written in the language of bureaucrats, do not explicitly refer to murder. They use phrases like evacuation, reduction, treatment, but there was never any doubt as to what the real meaning was. As Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's chief protagonist, wrote after reading them, the complete elimination of the European Jews. Now, social media can be a force for good. It exposes the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs, or the Chinese tennis star who has had to go into hiding because of her allegations of being assaulted by a Chinese politician. We've seen how the demonstrators have been treated in Afghanistan by government troops, and how the women in Afghanistan have been treated by the Taliban. Now, hundreds of years ago, rumors were spread by the church or whoever the government was at the time. They are now spread through social media, a force not always for good, but sometimes for evil, or just simply wishing to create hate. So regular postings have included: Jews control the banks, kill babies to drink their blood, they caused 9/11 and Grenfell. Jews spread COVID to weaken nations and secretly put a chip into the COVID vaccine. So the mass killings in Rwanda a few years ago happened because the Hutus were told on their radio stations that the Tutsis were evil, and nearly 1 million were killed. Now, recently, the United Nations adopted an Israeli resolution that condemns Holocaust denial and distortion of the Holocaust. It was supported by most countries, only Iran objected. So most people in the world are civil, decent, and caring, and we mustn't let the hate mongers thrive. Thank you.
Councillor Hazy, thank you very much indeed. And now we'll hear from the Leader of the Opposition, Councillor Ione Goldspeak. Ione, good evening.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to speak this evening. The practice of holding an annual Holocaust Memorial Day was established in the year 2000, following on from the Stockholm Declaration. Representatives from 46 governments around the world met in Stockholm to discuss the Holocaust, remembrance, and education. We remember that the Holocaust was a European tragedy that took place between 1933 and 1945. The Nazis systematically persecuted anyone and everyone of Jewish faith and background. They imprisoned them in ghettos and ghastly concentration camps. and then they murdered them by shooting or by gas chamber. We remember that by 1945, 6 million Jews had been murdered. It's very painful for us to remember these events, and it must be equally painful for modern young Germans, as they had nothing to do with the tragedy. It was not their fault. As well as remembering the tragic events, we honor the memory of all the people who perished. We pay tribute to the amazingly brave individuals who actually had the courage to speak out against what was happening. And we must always continue to care for those people who have survived. After we have remembered, I believe that we should work for reconciliation, for hope and for peace. I heard a little snippet on the radio this morning about the city of Coventry. Coventry Cathedral was bombed by the Germans in 1940. Some of the ruins were left untouched. And then a wooden cross was made from 2 of the charred roof timbers. This was a symbol of forgiveness. 2 nails were found in the ruins. They had melted together and made the shape of a small cross. And this has been used as a sign of reconciliation. A new cathedral has been built alongside the ruins of the old one, and this is a symbol of hope. And inside the cathedral, there's a chapel of reconciliation. I do hope that we can all work together for reconciliation, for the building of a better, kindlier world with freedom, respect, and justice for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Naomi Goldsmith. Many thanks.
In the summer of 1993, the soldiers started rounding up all Bosnian Muslim men in my hometown, and they were all taken away into concentration camps. I, as an 8-year-old boy, lost faith in all humanity.
Holocaust Memorial Day is very important for us. Students are very aware of conflicts going on around in the world. Today we're very lucky to have a survivor of the Bosnian genocide speak to our students and share his story with the students, because often students realize that these people are actually normal people, people that they can connect with and relate with, and it's really important for them to understand that these events could happen to anyone at any time.
It's not just words in a history textbook anymore. It's someone who we've seen, and he's told us his own story about how his life has been affected, so everything just became a lot more real.
We are in the borough of Wigan and Lee, and we've been performing our Holocaust Memorial Day. It has been very important for us as a group of people, and young people in the borough in particular. They've been learning about the Holocaust for many years.
I was invited to attend a Holocaust Day Memorial Trust event in Belfast. What they were looking to do was to run events inside each one of our prisons, and I began to think, well, how much better would it be if the prison population was actively involved?
It was very, very worthwhile, and it changed my life for good, so I'm so glad I took part in it.
We're in the Reading Civic offices, and we have been at a wonderful evening of prayer, reflection, symbolism, music.
We've learned the partisan song, which we're really proud of, so we're going to be singing that.
It made me feel like I was part of something bigger.
We knew about the Holocaust, but when we learn it in detail, you realise the horror, and it really does, it impacts you to think how lucky you are to be alive in this generation.
Events like this can really help the community to come together as one.
Now, let me introduce you to our next guest who's going to be joining us, and that is Sabrina Groschel. First, I'm going to mention to you that the Association of Jewish Refugees were planting 80 trees across the UK to commemorate their 80th birthday. And one of those trees ended up in the grounds of Hertford Castle. This was about 2 weeks ago. And I know that the Mayor of Hertford, Bob Deering, was there. The East Herts chairman was also there, Ken Crofton. And I believe it was a fascinating morning. And the Association of Jewish Refugees, I think, have also worked with Action Reconciliation Service for Peace, but Sabrina Groschel will now tell us exactly what they do, and we will hear from her. Sabrina.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you. I wonder, would it be okay if I shared something with you on the screen?
Yes, can you do that if you're not a host or co-host?
I think somebody would need to give me permission for that.
Oh, right, okay.
If not, it doesn't matter.
I don't know if Stephen or Mark can do that at the moment. Is that feasible for you to give temporary hosting to Sabrina? Sabrina, yes, you can now share. Yeah.
Yes, it still says host disabled participant sharing screen. I think the easiest way to enable it is to make me a temporary co-host.
Oh, okay, Stephen, can that be done?
Now it works. Thank you.
Ah, excellent, good.
Wonderful. Yeah, so thank you so much for inviting me to tell you a bit about Action Reconciliation Service for Peace. We've been working in the UK for 61 years now. Our history as an organization is a little bit longer. We started our work in Germany in 1958, and what I want to do tonight is to tell you, first of all, how we came to be in existence, and then what we have developed into today. So we started off, it all started off with the gentleman that you see here on the right, Lothar Kreisig. He was a judge in Germany in the 1930s, a family judge, and he was also a lay member of the Synod of Lutheran Churches in Germany. And what happened to him during the 1930s is that he realized that more and more often he was getting requests to send people with disabilities to hospitals. And he then realized that they weren't coming back from there, and he started doing his research, what was happening to them, and discovered what the T4 action, the euthanasia program that the Nazis were running, was doing. And once he discovered this, he said, well, this is not something that I as a Christian can do and can be part of, and then refused to sign these orders to have disabled people with disabilities, sent to these hospitals where these acts of euthanasia were committed. As a result, he was put under house arrest for the remaining reign of the Nazi regime, and suffered some other repercussions. But anyway, he survived the war, and after the war, he went on campaigning in the Lutheran churches in Germany to say, look, we didn't do enough as Christians to prevent this. And we looked away, and we have committed crimes, and we need to face up to that. And for quite a number of years, nobody wanted to listen to him. And it was only in 1958 that the synod meeting of the Council of Lutheran Churches in Germany finally allowed him to put a resolution forward to bring into existence an organization within the church that would deal with the legacy of the church having committed crimes. And what he said to the synod, you see here now, we Germans started the Second World War and have thus more than others inflicted immeasurable suffering on humans, on humanity. And sorry, the screen is now covered by my line here. Germans killed millions of Jews in a sacrilegious revolt against God. Those of us who survived and didn't want it to happen didn't do enough to prevent it. And that is still something that is central to us, that call into action and that call to acknowledging that we have committed crimes as Christians in Germany. And yeah, we started then working in Germany, trying to get churches to recognize their failings. And we then started sending young Germans who were very encouraged by the church acknowledging their guilt, first of all to the Netherlands, to work with communities who had been affected by the Nazi crimes. And then in 1961, we sent the first group of 14 volunteers to England. They were invited to Coventry Cathedral. We already heard about it. And what they did there in 1961, first of all, was to start clearing out rubble out of the ruins of the old cathedral. When we arrived in Coventry, there was a discussion about the name of our organization. In German, we're not actually called Action Reconciliation Service for Peace. We are called Action Atonement Service for Peace. And in German, it is very important for us to keep that word atonement, because we feel, even though we are now, everybody who works at ARSP and all the volunteers who volunteer with us, we are all generations removed from those people who committed the crimes themselves. But we feel, while we are no longer guilty ourselves, we have a responsibility to make sure that this doesn't happen again, possibly more than others. And it is not our place as Germans to ask for reconciliation, but it is our place to do acts of atonement. And we feel very strongly about this. However, the clergy at Coventry in 1961 felt that word atonement was too big and too heavy, and that people in the UK would struggle with it. So they renamed us, which is how in the UK we came to be Action Reconciliation Service for Peace. Now, those young people that you see there are very stern looking. You can see them here at work in the old cathedral. Eventually they moved on to help build the new cathedral. So in those early days, all of our projects that we did with young people were building projects. Eventually they started clearing rubble again in the East End in London. But it was only really in the 1970s and 80s that we started working with Jewish communities, and particularly with the Association of Jewish Refugees. Before that, the idea of Germans going and talking to Holocaust survivors and helping them in their homes, which is what our volunteers do today, was really unthinkable. However, this is last year's volunteer group, so you can see that the way our volunteers look have changed just as the times have changed. They no longer clear rubble, but they work in a multitude of organizations. You will hear from two of our volunteers later. And we don't just have volunteers in the UK, we actually send volunteers to 14 countries, mostly in Europe, but also to Israel and the US. We have volunteers in Russia, in Belarus, in Ukraine, Belgium, France, the Netherlands. Later on, I'll tell you, we have also got volunteers in Germany. And the UK continues to be one of our strong project countries. Normally, when we're not in the middle of the pandemic, all of our volunteers in the UK work with Holocaust survivors through the Association of Jewish Refugees. That is probably, for me personally, the most important aspect of our voluntary services, that our young people engage with the survivors who live here and the Kindertransportees who live here, so that they get to hear the stories of the Holocaust firsthand, and can then later on carry that on, those stories, when they're back at home, and through that move other people's lives as well. During the pandemic, that has been a bit difficult for COVID safety reasons. Going into elderly people's homes hasn't happened so much. We've had Zoom calls, but I don't think it quite replaces that. But hopefully moving forward, we will be able to return to those home visits. They don't just talk to them in the home visits. So what you have to think is they usually visit them once a week in their homes, and they don't just sit and talk, but they do practical jobs for them. So that could be going shopping with them, that could be helping them with a computer issue, that could be doing some gardening together, some cooking. It could even be going to the theatre together. So every volunteer and their AJR member that they visit develop their own unique relationship, and sometimes very, very long-lasting friendships. And we're so grateful to the Association of Refugees and their members that they are enabling those friendships and connections to be formed. So that's what they do one day a week normally. And for the rest of the week, our volunteers, because they are here full time for 12 months, they work in projects in historical and political education with people who are socially disadvantaged, so homeless people and refugees, with people with disabilities. I've already mentioned refugees and asylum seekers, and other minorities. We've also got one volunteer who works with the Roma support group. And through working in those fields, some of them do historical education, so are very, very close to Holocaust education, but through working with people who are socially disadvantaged or who have disabilities or are minorities in this country, they get an insight into the lives of people who are very much removed from where they usually come from. Most of our volunteers are sort of A-level school leavers, I don't want to take away from what our volunteers are going to tell you about their experience of working in those projects. So I'll probably leave it there, and you will hear about that. What today we really are about is that we're committed to working towards reconciliation and peace, as well as fighting racism, discrimination, and social exclusion. So through learning from the past, we want to create a better future. And as I say, we as Germans feel that it is our responsibility to make sure that the lessons we learn from the past really aren't forgotten. Now, I've told you about the projects that they're in and the visits that they do to the Holocaust survivors, but there's another aspect to our work, and that is Holocaust education. What we ask all of our volunteers to do before they join us in the various countries is to talk to their families about their experiences of history in the 1930s and 40s. And that means they have to talk to parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, sometimes do a bit of research in archives. And they bring material and they bring these stories. And very few of our young people have a very straightforward story. So we've already heard Laura is German, she lives in Germany, but her parents both have Italian origin. So we all have mixed biographies. So the family stories that they tell are very mixed. They are stories that have perpetrators in them. Other stories have victims in them. Other stories are mixed. What you see here is a collage that one of our young people a few years ago created about her family history. and she has Polish origins on the one side. On the other side, she has a very German history. She had a grandfather who was in the SS. She had a grandmother who lived in Poland, and saw the Jews being moved into the ghetto, and we then talk within the group about how does it make us feel that we've got perpetrators in our family history. Our grandparents, our great-grandparents, some of them were actively involved what happened, others were bystanders and let it happen, didn't do anything to prevent it. And it is really important that we come to terms with where do we come from, because our heritage influences how we then talk to people about the past, and also how we move into the future. As I say, the family biographies are really, really different. This is somebody who, as you can see there, doesn't have any German background in there, but again, it is really important that they reflect on their family history and the story of migration, which again might make them able to empathize more with people who have got that refugee story in their life, because they had to flee Germany and came to England here on the Kindertransport, possibly, or after the war. And then here we see a group of our volunteers with a lady who survived Bergen-Belsen as a very young child. So they visit individual people, but we also make sure that we have these meetings as a group with survivors, and those meetings are really good to bring together that reflection on our own family biography and the stories that we hear from the survivors. As I've said, we are doing what we're doing because we feel as Germans we have a responsibility to make sure that the past is not forgotten, and that we equip our young generation to educate others. But 10 years ago now, we started recognizing that actually it's not enough just for us to say we'll educate our young people, but we should also give people from other countries the opportunity to have a similar experience of engaging and experiencing history. And we started running what we call our Germany program. And I'd like to play you a short video clip before I hand over to our volunteers that will tell you a little bit about our Germany program. I know in the UK, voluntary services are not that well known, but just to sort of give you the background, the volunteers are provided with accommodation free of charge and travel free of charge. So in London, our volunteers get a travel card to use the Underground. They also receive pocket money so that they can survive for the year without having to have independent means. And that's the same conditions for those who come from other countries to Germany. I always really struggle to find British young people to participate in this because it's just so unknown, and they usually go, I can't afford to just work for free for a year, but it's not quite for free. So let me share with you this video of an amazing young person who is volunteering in Germany.
My name is Nathan. I come from Ukraine, from the city called Chernivtsi. I'm doing currently my voluntary year on the program called Action Reconciliation for Peace, and working in the House of the Wannsee conference. Basically, every day is different. My tasks can be various, like translations to video editing or working in the library. Since December, I think I started making guided tours here, which was also very interesting for me. The house itself, it's a very interesting place. It's a very interesting example of a commemorative culture in Germany, which was part of my motivation, one can say, for applying for this year. The team is very diverse and all people are different, and it's just like very cool to be in this environment. The first thing that I will definitely take with me is just how much more knowledge I gained about the history of the Second World War and the Holocaust. I enjoy being in Berlin. Together with my flatmates, we also visited different museums or some parties or some concerts. And also my big passion in Berlin is swimming pools, because I really like swimming. Yeah, I had some best times of my life in Berlin at the kitchen at our apartment, when we cooked together or just discussing our experiences here as volunteers. It's been really like a support circle for me. This has been a great experience for me language-wise, because it's also great that ASF offers you support for the language courses. And I just cannot emphasize how much I became more confident in German, and how much I benefited from it, and from just being in a language environment all the time. ASF was established as an organization for young Germans originally to go to other lands, but now it works in 18 countries, I believe, and people don't only go from Germany to other countries, but also to Germany from other countries.
I would now like to hand over to Laura and Daniel, who are going to give you a volunteer perspective. And I think our volunteers are always much better at bringing across what we're actually about.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. We'll go over then to either Daniel first or Laura, whoever wants to go first.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting us to speak to you this evening. My name is Laura Walle, and I'm an ARSP volunteer at the Wiener Holocaust Library in London. The Wiener Holocaust Library is the world's oldest and Britain's largest collection of original archival material on the Nazi era and the Holocaust. And the library has its origins in the work of Dr. Alfred Wiener, who campaigned against Nazism during the 1920s and 1930s. And he gathered evidence about anti-Semitism and the persecution of Jews in Germany. Dr. Wiener and his family fled Germany in 1933 and settled in Amsterdam. Later that year, he set up the Jewish Central Information Office at the request of the Board of Deputies of British Jews and the Anglo-Jewish Association. This archive collected information about the Nazis, which formed the basis of campaigns to undermine their activities. Following the November pogrom of 1938, Wiener prepared to bring his collection to the UK. It arrived the following summer and is believed to have opened on the day the Nazis invaded Poland. Throughout the war, the Jewish Central Information Office served the British government as it fought the Nazi regime. Increasingly, the collection was referred to as Dr. Wiener's Library, and eventually this led to its renaming. The library holds some of the earliest accounts produced by survivors of the Holocaust, as well as the collection of Nazi documents and photographs, and hundreds of unique collections relating to the experiences of Jewish refugee families who came to Britain in the 1930s and 1940s. One of my tasks at the library is to help with the digitalization of the early accounts of Holocaust survivors, and thereby to make them easily accessible for the public. The vision of the Wiener Holocaust Library is to be a continuously developing library, archive and information service for the UK and for the international community, dedicating to supporting research, learning, teaching, and advocacy about the Holocaust and genocide, their causes and consequences. The library provides a resource to oppose anti-Semitism and other forms of prejudice and intolerance. It is their mission to serve scholars, researchers, and the media as a library of record, but maybe more importantly, to be a living memorial to the evils of the past by ensuring that our wealth of materials is put at the service of the future, and to engage with people of all ages and backgrounds in understanding the Holocaust and its historical context through an active educational program.
Hello, my name is Daniel Gerstner and I'm an ARSP volunteer at the Queen Victoria's Human Rest in Poplar. The Queen Victoria's Human Rest provides accommodation for seafarers, both active and retired, ex-servicemen, and other adults in need of accommodation. We aim to do this in a caring environment where individuals are helped and encouraged physically, mentally, and spiritually to meet their full potential, regardless of their ethnic or religious background, and hopefully, eventually, return to being able to stand on their own feet again. The residents are supported by a welfare team, but also us, the volunteers, who provide a program of afternoon and evening activities for them. My project might not have a direct link to the Holocaust, but I believe that through my actions and through engaging in conversation with the residents, I am able to pass on some of the values that I and ARSP stand for. Through that, I'm hoping to make a contribution to fight racism, discrimination, and social exclusion. The former German President Joachim Gauck said, "There's no German identity without Auschwitz. Our history has given us Germans the task and responsibility, even in the third or fourth generation, to never look away when we see acts of racism, discrimination, or social exclusion, but to stand up for justice and peace and to give a home to anyone who is fleeing from terror and war." This response might sound simplistic and unrealistic, bearing in mind that the current developments in Germany and elsewhere in Europe and beyond. We too often hear news about the burning of refugee hostels and demonstrations with xenophobic slogans that remind us of the time when Hitler first came to power. And often it might seem that people's lives go on with no awareness of being on the cusp of history repeating itself.
But that is not the full story. From our own experiences, I can assure you that our generation of Germans remains sensitized to our duty of not letting history repeat itself and recognizes injustice and intolerance. The Second World War, with all of its developments, horrors, and consequences, is the main topic of history lessons in Germany. School trips to Auschwitz or other memorial sites are just as much part of our education as the analysis of the origins of the Holocaust and the opportunity to meet with eyewitnesses who suffered Nazi persecution or resisted the regime. If we are honest, there are also still many perpetrator eyewitnesses, as well as their children, who should give their testimony. These interactions would give us additional perspectives to complement the discussion in German families and in society.
The opportunity to continue a dialogue with those whose lives have been impacted by the Holocaust during our voluntary service with ARSP add a further piece to my image of that time. I'm truly grateful for every story that people share with me about their past. Both at school and subsequently during this year, I feel privileged to have had these fascinating encounters already with amazing personalities who survived the war and have shared with me what happened all those years ago. Knowing their stories, I will do my best to ensure that similar atrocities to individuals will not be repeated. It is so important that as we reach a point where soon the survivors will no longer be able to tell their stories for themselves, my generation passes on their accounts to future generations. I will tell my children what they had to go through if they don't have the opportunity to hear the experiences directly from an eyewitness anymore. With the knowledge about the past, we can learn from history and create a brighter future. There are many ways that people who are aware of German history are accomplishing the task of not letting history repeat itself and of working towards a more just and peaceful future. In my case, it is my working with the men who have, for one reason or another, become socially disadvantaged. Other volunteers in our group are spending their year here helping refugees settle in the UK, while others are working with adults with learning disabilities.
We all wish for a world of peaceful coexistence where everyone respects each other. These anecdotes coincide with the answer given by a Holocaust survivor, a kind and wise man who, when asked once what our generation should learn from the Third Reich, without thinking twice, answered, being tolerant. Tolerance within a framework of justice, under the rule of law, in a free and open society is one of the key elements that we should learn from the Holocaust. The fact that through my voluntary service I have met so many others who aim to put Gauck's words and the survivor's message into action enables me to feel confident and positive about the future. They give me hope that in the end voices of tolerance and respect will be stronger than hate and racism, and that life for the third and fourth generation goes on without forgetting Auschwitz and in peace. Thank you.
Thank you. And can I ask you, perhaps first Daniel, first of all, when you go and visit once a week the Holocaust survivor, what sort of things do you talk about? What sort of things do you do?
That's unlucky because I'm actually one of the few volunteers in our group who are not doing the weekly visitings. I'm working full-time 5 days a week at the Queen Victoria Siemens West.
Okay, and what about you, Laura? What do they want to talk about? Do they want to talk about the past or not?
I'm so sorry to tell you that my visiting hasn't started yet.
Ah, right, okay, fair enough. But your work in the Wiener Library, which is all about Holocaust education.
Yes.
I mean, Germany is one of those countries that actually has faced its past, which is not, you can't necessarily say that for all of the countries involved. Has the information that you've acquired at the Wiener Library, has that really surprised you?
I mean, I did go much more into depth by working there because I'm especially reading translations of German accounts, like eyewitnesses in Germany in the 1950s told interviewers at the Wiener Library about their experiences in camps, and I'm reading a lot of these accounts, and by that I got like an even further look into the Holocaust. Yeah.
And Sabrina, can I just ask you, those volunteers that don't come to Britain but go to other countries, what sort of work do they do?
Again, it is a breadth of projects. In Israel, I think all of our volunteers work with Holocaust survivors, while in Russia, for example, very few of them do, simply because fewer Holocaust survivors are now living in Russia, and Russia is a big country. The ones that are there are scattered about, but they work with human rights charities. Yeah, our projects are really diverse, but we do try and create as many opportunities for our volunteers to hear survivors' accounts. The fact that Laura and Daniel haven't started visiting anyone has to do with COVID. Normally they would have started in September. So it's an unfortunate year for us to talk to you about this, really. But yeah, normally that sort of visiting would start in September.
And you yourself, Sabrina, are you born and brought up in Germany?
I spent a fair chunk of my childhood in Germany. I came over here for secondary education, and since then have sort of spent time, a few years studying in Germany, a few years studying here. I've very much got, yeah, I feel at home in both countries.
There's very little trace of a German accent, that's why I was curious. Sabrina, Laura, Daniel, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening.
Germans were sterilising or castrating all coloured men with German nationality. A few weeks later, a coloured friend of mine was summoned to the Gestapo headquarters in Frankfurt. I never saw him again.
It's interesting the way we're doing it today. Different faces pop up all the time this evening. But the face that will be popping up right now will be the rabbi from Harlow Synagogue. And Harlow Synagogue has members from East Hertfordshire, from Broxbourne, as well as from Harlow. So welcome this evening, Rabbi Irit Schimmel.
Thank you very much. I'd like to share with you two poems that are written by an Israeli poet called Rivka Miriam. She was very much influenced by the Holocaust through which her parents lived. The first one is called, What does a person who doesn't know, what does a person do who doesn't know how to die? What does a person do who doesn't know how to die and when his day comes, stays alive? Who continues to take a bite of raisin cake while seated on a chair to read, buys eggs and bread, pinch a woman's thigh, who tries to learn a new language. His parents, children and grandchildren are already gone. The cells in his body withered a while ago, but on his wrist, his watch still goes on turning as the hours do. And he looks at it and starts running, not to be late. What does a person do who doesn't know how to die and when his day comes, stays alive? In whose body they forgot to plant the secret of his death at the moment he was created, whose reflections in the mirror facing him depart one by one, and he stays to wave to them, waits, and for a moment looks, but doesn't stop. The second poem is called We Didn't Get Used to Dying. We didn't get used to dying, though our death, like an old husband, lies close to us and his arm, as if asleep, carelessly hugs the thickness of our hip. And as we turn our back, he asks something, and at first is answered with a hum and a yawn, until we are entwined with him in the desired pleasure, and he breathes heavily like one calling for war, and bone against bone come close, making noise, till falling down in silence. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Irit. Well, we'll now hear from Catherine Henderson, and Catherine is involved with Hearts Welcomes Refugees. And as I mentioned earlier on, initially, it was very much a situation where she was helping to process Syrian refugees. Now, though, we're talking about refugees from Afghanistan. So perhaps we'll get an update from you, Catherine, and then if you'd like to introduce your animated film after that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to speak this evening. Many of you will remember Juan, who came with his parents to speak at this event a few years ago. He talked about his experiences crossing Syria as a teenager to join his family in Lebanon, terrified in case his bus was stopped and he would be forced to stay behind and join the Syrian army. His family settled in East Harts under the Syrian Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme. He worked for some years at the hairdressing salon Headlines in Benja, where I think he was working when he spoke at this event. And he's recently started a tailoring business in Stevenage. I'll put details in the chat in case any of you, like me, could do with some help with mending and alterations. Just thought you'd like an update about him. Joanne's family is one of 7 families resettled under the scheme who have made their homes in East Harts. Harts Welcomes Refugees supports them alongside other families and individuals who are seeking asylum. County-wide, we support getting on for 70 families plus individuals. That's not including recent arrivals from Afghanistan. Locally, this includes running a women's group in St Mary's Church, Ware, and for a while we helped with a pop-up Syrian cafe in Ware High Street, which was a great success over the summer. At Christmas, Year 7 children and staff from Seal School in Hertford put together boxes of cards and gifts for every family we work with in East Harts and Broxbourne. The Syrian scheme has now come to an end, and the future of resettlement is unclear. It is not mentioned in the Nationality and Borders Bill. There is now a focus on resettling people from Afghanistan, and Harts Welcomes Refugees is one of the organisations working with the County Council to support 320 or so people, families and individuals, in hotels and guest houses in the west of the county. Since they arrived, we have had volunteers and trustees at the hotels most days of the week, dispensing clothing, providing language support, and organising activity sessions. It is taking a long time for the Home Office to match families to housing, but 6 families are now resettled in Hertfordshire. These families will be supported by the Refugee Council, who managed the Syrian resettlement scheme. We hope soon to have our first Afghan family in East Harts, thanks to the initiative of a local landlord who came forward to offer her property to East Harts District Council for this purpose. It would be wonderful if others followed her example. When Harts Welcomes Refugees was first formed, as Jonathan mentioned, as Harts Welcome Syrian Families, several of us came to speak at an East Harts District Council meeting. I think it was Katie Seaton who actually spoke about our hopes and local enthusiasm for the government's scheme. Since then, Katie has made 2 films, the first telling the story of one of the refugees resettled in Hertfordshire, and the second, which we're going to see tonight, setting contemporary forced migration in the context of our shared migration story. I wrote the script for this film, which is called Roots, and my daughter Rosie did the animation for both, so it is all very much homegrown in East Harts. Both films have, however, been shown widely. The first won a prize in a film festival, and Roots was selected for the Refugee Week Film Festival last year. It is also on a number of websites and is a resource for teachers at Migration Museum in London. I'll put our website details in the chat, as I hope you will watch both films. They are very short, and perhaps consider sharing and showing them too. I hope Roots speaks for itself, but I will just say that the central image comes from the geneticist and broadcaster Adam Rutherford's book, A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived. He describes our family trees as a mass of tangled roots that intertwine and connect. This image shows graphically how there is no scientific basis for the idea of race. We are all descended from people from all parts of the world. In fact, we only need to go back 3,500 years to find a common ancestor of everyone alive on Earth today. We are that closely related. When I go into schools, I like to tell the children this and get them to look around at others in their classroom. So we could do the same now in this Zoom meeting. This is important, I think, because we need to recognise our connection. We know that our distant ancestors survived by cooperating, and also that they cared for vulnerable members of their groups. So in a way, they give us a blueprint for walking together into the future. You will notice at the very end of the credits a reference to Alamas, who has a picture on her wall of herself in her garden in Syria, surrounded by pots overflowing with red flowers. This gave me one of the images for the film. Alamas is Juan's mother, and she lit a candle at the Holocaust Memorial event he spoke at. I hope you enjoy the film. Thank you.
We walked and we walked, before the land and sea had names, before we could measure 1,000 miles or count 1,000 years. As the ice rolled slowly back, we went forward with everything that was green and fresh and new, spreading its fingers out into the world.
Sometimes I am a bird. We sweep across the land and everywhere is our home.
And sometimes I am a tree. We send our roots deep into the earth, and together we grow into a forest. Like a river, we flow through the land, leaving behind things you will find and puzzle over. We tell stories and worship gods that you will never know.
Little by little, we begin to farm and to make pots and wheels, to write and build cities. And sometimes people in the cities look out and think that those of us roving across the land outside are wild and untamed like our animals and might steal their children or their beautiful things. Across oceans, we bring our music, our knowledge, our religions, our languages, ourselves, mixing and melding and constantly changing.
No one was always here. Everyone came from somewhere else.
Sometimes we choose to go, and sometimes we have no choice.
We walk and we walk, all of us together.
Where do I belong now that I have no home?
Through a world sliced up by fences, walls and checkpoints. They call it security. Along tracks in the dark, under the cold stars.
Sometimes people look at us and think, we are coming to invade. We are floods and hordes battering at your doors. Why not just call us people?
I remember security. It is not a fence or wall, or men in uniform with guns. It is the smell of dinner cooking when I came home from school. It is playing in the garden. My mother's flowers spilling all shades of red over the edges of their pots. It is filling a basket with pomegranates under the trees. And the bustle and chatter of the market before the bombs came.
The moon is resting on her back tonight, and I am sleeping in a ditch in France. If one day you should find me, living on your street, going to your school, come round and I'll tell you a story. Long, long ago, your ancestors and mine set out across Africa. Their descendants passed through every part of the world, and though we may look nothing like each other now, follow the roots of our family trees, down into the past, and eventually they join. Tonight, the same moon that shone on them shines down on all of us. On a world that is never still, a world where the ice is slipping away, the waters rising, forests burning, and people are moving.
Catherine, thank you very much indeed. It's a fascinating film. I've seen it, I think it must be 4 times now at least. That's really impressive. Well done to you, and well done to your daughter, and indeed everybody else involved as well.
Thank you.
Yes. I'm just going to mention to you, those of you that were at our commemoration a couple of years ago, you may remember Leslie Kleinman, a Holocaust survivor, was with us. Unfortunately, Leslie died last year. He was, when he came to us, 90, and he died at the age of 92 last June. And, you know, he really, really did suffer in Auschwitz and lost 68 members of his family who were killed in Auschwitz. And eventually, when the war was over, he went to, I think, a monastery initially, on liberation. He comes originally from what is now Transylvania. It's now in Romania. I think at the time it might have been in Hungary. But a remarkable man. He was once asked about the death march that he had to go on, because when Allied troops, Soviet troops were moving towards the concentration camps, the Nazis would often round up the Jews and indeed all the others in the camps and get them just to march and march and march. And of course, a lot of them died because they were very weak anyway. And this was a 300-mile march. And he was once asked how he kept going on the 300-mile death march. And he simply replied, just one step at a time. A remarkable man. And that's Leslie Kleiman, who got the British Empire Medal. And he was born in May 1929, and he died last June. That's 2021. May his memory be for a blessing. Now, let's introduce our next rabbi, who's Rabbi Yaakov Tatz from Welling Garden City Synagogue. And Rabbi Tatz, I think I saw a video of you earlier in the day releasing some white doves. Was that you?
Yes, guilty as charged.
Oh, that was to do with Welling Garden City's commemoration, was it earlier?
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us this evening, and perhaps you'd like to speak to us for a few minutes.
I would. Thank you very much. It's an honor. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay. Fantastic. My computer's been playing up a little bit. Okay, so I'd like to share with you a very quick story about the Holocaust, which has had an enormous impact on myself. And my feeling, this is my feeling, you know, take it or leave it, is that being sad and remembering sad things is helpful as much as it's constructively helpful for our future. And this is one of those stories that I don't think I'll ever forget, and I think is very, very powerful in terms of, you know, how we move forward. The story goes that there's a small town very, very, very close, bordering on the city of Tel Aviv in Israel, and next to the city of Tel Aviv is a small town called Bnei Brak, and there was an elderly survivor. He was actually a very big rabbi of a community. So he passed away, and his children were sitting shiva. They were mourning. They were observing the shiva, which is a 7-day mourning period that many Jews observe when someone in the family dies. And you know, the community was sitting there. Everyone was comforting the children, and in walked a fellow who was clearly not from the community. He was an Israeli fellow, but he was completely of a different community and culture, and he stood out. He stuck out like a sore thumb, one may say. And somebody asked him, you know, did you know the rabbi who passed away? And he said we were actually in the camps together. And the entire room just went, you know, completely silent. And they brought him forward to the children, and he said, you know, I was in the camps with your father, and your father saved my life. So they said, okay. So he said, I'll tell you the story. He said, there was one day I don't remember the camp it was in. So there was one day I was rummaging in the rubbish for some food, and I knew that if I don't find food now, I will die. I was at the end, I was crawling on my hands and knees, and I was at the very end. I had absolutely no energy, no strength left whatsoever. And I knew that if I don't get food now, that's it, I'm done. And your father, this rabbi, right, who passed away, your father came and he saw me, and I said, please tell me you have something to, please tell me you have a tiny bit of food, anything. And he said, I'm sorry, I don't, but I can give you a hug. And he gave him a hug. He said and then he told the children, he goes, your father gave me a hug, and somehow, somewhere, that gave me energy to carry on living, and I lived. And he survived the war, and he said, your father's hug saved my life, you know. And to me, that's so poignant. It's like we're living in a time, we're living in a day and an age where in so many ways we have such an abundance, we have so much, right, in a material sense compared to, many generations in our history. Yet in so many ways we're so lost, we're so empty of love. And just for example, the mental health crisis of today, the statistics are staggering how many people are suffering. And it's so easy sometimes, just give someone a hug, right? Just give someone a hug, smile at them, make somebody else feel good. And it's my hope and my prayer and my blessing that together we could look to the past and learn from our past and look to the future and heal the world and make it a better place, one hug at a time. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to speak. It's an honor and a privilege, and have a good evening.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, I mean, we take a lot for granted, but actually it's the non-material things that are really so important, and the way that we respond to each other. Thank you very much, Rabbi Tatz. I think it was last year we first had this commemoration on Zoom because of the situation. And I would not have thought that we'd be doing this 2 years running and that we'd be in the council chamber. But nonetheless, I think it was better to do it this way than not to have that. But hopefully next year we will be able to be together in the council chamber once again. Now we're going to end this evening with a song, but in Yiddish. The former chief rabbi, Lord Jonathan Sachs, who sadly died about 1.5 years ago now, he was a huge fan of the songwriter and singer Leonard Cohen. And Yiddish itself, which is a derivative of German, in fact, my own father, he went to a Jewish school in London where they actually taught German, and he spoke a lot of Yiddish to his parents because his parents were originally from Poland and they tended to speak Yiddish. And he would often speak Yiddish to my mother when he didn't want me to understand what he was talking about. So unfortunately, I only picked up the odd word here and there. But what we're going to do now is to hear a singer by the name of Daniel Kahn. And here he is singing Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah, which is a well-known song. It was a big hit a few years ago, but he's singing it in Yiddish. Daniel Kahn.
Gewinn an Nigen wie a Sod, was David hat gespielt vor Gott, nur dir wollt's nicht gewinn als a Yeshua. Und me singt a Zoi, a Fa, a Sol, a Mische Berg hebt a Kol, der Duller Melech webt a Halleluja. Deine Munde ist geworden schwach, B'sheva bot sich auf und Dach, ihr Chein, die Levone, dein Refuhr. Und sie nimmt dein Guff, sie nimmt dein Kopf, sie schneidet von deiner Haare Zop und zieht von Meul a Robe, Halleluja. Und ich kenn dein Stil, ich bin geschlafen auf dein Deal, ich hab kein Mal nicht gelebt mit Ersatz nur. Nur ich seh dein Schloss, ich seh dein Form, ein Herz ist nicht kein Melechstrom, es ist ein kalte und ein kalte Halleluja. Wie einmal, to sag mir euch, was tut sich dort in dein Scheuß, du wusch darfst dich schämen wie a Psula. Und gedenk, wie ich hab in dir geruht, wie die Schiene glut in unser Blut und jeder Atem tut a Halleluja. sein mein Gott ist gar nicht da. Und Liebe soll sein Kolm und Roh, a Puss der Träum, zerbrochen und mechule. Sie nicht kein Gewein in Mitternacht, nicht kein bald Schuwe aufgewacht, nur an Elente kol Keure, Halleluja. Und ab ich Keures rufst du mich, mit Shem Hawaii läster ich, nur Meile, ich der Wart nicht kein Geule. Nur es brennt sich heiß in jeden Oss, von Alef Beis, gor bis in Sof, die Heilige und Kalle, Halleluja. Halleluja, 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 Halleluja. Das ist alles, es ist nicht kein Sach. Ich mach derweile, was ich mach. Ich komm da wie ein Mensch, nicht kein Schaluje. Gott als verloren, sei wie sei, will ich verleuden Adonai und schreien will ich heim. Halleluja, Halleluja. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah.
Chairman, over to you.
Well, all I can say is, wow, hasn't this all been extraordinary? I did actually write a few words just to close this, but frankly, none of them would do justice to what we've just heard. What I will just add, before I start to close this commemoration, I would just add to your earlier words, Jonathan, about the tree planting and Harper Castle, because that was on behalf of the Association with Jewish Refugees, as you said. And listening to our three young contributors about the education, well, this tree planting will provide a living legacy to remind future generations of the horrors of those persecutions. But it was this country's good fortune from then and now that we've all benefited, and that we're able to provide a safe haven to all these refugees fleeing from Nazi Germany and around the world. So that was a very good thing to do at Harper, for the 80 trees for 80 years being planted all around the United Kingdom. So I would like to thank you all for being here, and for the last hour and a half. I found it interesting, fascinating, and informative, and our speakers were just extraordinary. So thank you all who assisted with making this evening possible. Jonathan, your silky tones, you should try being a radio presenter. But also from East Herts Council, Stephen King, Claire Pullen, of course, East Hart, Elsa Piper, and from Southern Maltings in Ware, Mark Wilkinson. So thank you all for putting this together, and thank you all for the contributors tonight. It's been fantastically interesting. Perhaps next time we might be in the council chamber, but this time we're unable to host you all and provide you with a glass of wine and a crinkly sandwich afterwards. But perhaps next time we might be more fortunate to all get together in person. That'd be rather nice. So pour yourself a drink and relax, and thank you all for a very, very interesting